Welcome everybody. Here and on the video, my name is Ola Pegg. There's about one person who I didn't know before, and many on the video hopefully later. Finbrit strives for inclusiveness, diversity and lifelong learning, and we do that via our offerings, and we offer English tests, IELTS and Cambridge, English language learning and events. And we have an event today, and we welcome Ambassador Tom Dodd to speak about human rights and diplomacy, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Finbrits and members for inviting me along today to speak about human rights and diplomacy. And it's usually a very bad thing for any ambassador to start off with an apology. But I do that by saying I'm not a human rights expert. Most of my career has been in security work and in areas like that. But of course, any ambassador, any diplomat has to deal with human rights issues which are very important to British embassies, but also to the British government. So I'll say a bit about that now. So human rights. What are human rights? Where do they come from? There are sort of certain rights that are universal and inalienable, that govern the sort of norms and rules of how we treat each other, essentially, and how organisations treat each other and their people. So things like the right to a fair trial, the right to free speech, protection from enslavement. There are conventions on, for example, against genocide, conventions and protocols around the rights of women. Not interesting enough on Lgbt rights, but I'll come back to that. And where did this all start? So I think as a British ambassador, I'm very proud that a lot of the whole origins of the concept of rights actually starts in England, in Scotland, in the United Kingdom. Famously, the Magna Carta was one of the first quasi-written constitutions. The right to essentially not to have taxation without representation. When you move forward from that, you get to the 17th century. You have the English Civil War, about rights, the rights of monarchs, the rights of people. It's really quite advanced thinking there by the radical elements, but that leads to things like the Bill of Rights. Important provisions on habeas corpus, so you cannot be locked up without due legal process. Later, this goes further in Europe with the Enlightenment in the 18th century, and really culminates at the end of the 18th century with, of course, the US and the American Revolution. The US Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, notice not women, but I take men as being and women, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, you have the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. Of course, these actually are for men, not for women at this stage. Women come a bit later. And through the 19th century, things move on, particularly in international humanitarian law. So previously, a lot of international law is sort of customary law, things you do by habit. Starts to be written down in the 19th century. So you have the Geneva Conventions, famously in the mid-19th century, start appearing about how you treat prisoners and how you treat people on the battlefield, for example. So things start to move forward, drawing on much longer concepts. But it's not actually really until after the Second World War that you really get the codification of international human rights law. You have, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You have conventions on genocide and so on and so forth. In the UK, in Europe, importantly, you have the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, which is a very important document. It talks about the right to life, for example, the right to religious freedom, the right to a fair trial. They're all built into the ECHR, which is an important part of UK law. It's actually fed into UK law in our Human Rights Act and forms the basis of many laws around Europe. So that's a sort of bit of a legal canter through the background. Now again, as a non-expert, I see there are a couple of problem areas with the concept of human rights law and how it is applied. Firstly, in terms of the sort of international law, effectively there is a patchwork of these conventions, declarations, that all sort of work together in a sort of imperfect way, to be honest. So you have conventions which a lot of people haven't signed. If they've signed them, they haven't ratified them, so they haven't come into force. There's a big question about enforcement of rights, clearly. I mean, Finland is a country that has a very strong human rights record, a very strong human rights legislation. But as in my country, in the UK, there are issues around enforcement. So, for example, Finland is known to have an issue with domestic violence, for example, compared to other countries. It's known there are issues around racial equality in Finland. These are well-known things. So, how do you actually enforce laws when the law hasn't made it actually work? Then, of course, you've got countries that deliberately breach international human rights norms. So, we've seen that, unfortunately, significantly in Belarus at the moment, where the government's quite clearly breaching people's human rights in all sorts of ways. People are being tortured, beaten up, no right to free speech, etc., etc., etc. It's quite a serious situation. We see in Hong Kong, where the Chinese government has acted in contravention of its international obligations. So that's a breaching international law. And then I think one of the other big issues is how rights change over time. And again, I think because making laws takes time, the whole area of rights moves ahead of the legal base and legal practice. So the classic example of this I take would be LGBT rights, which is actually in terms of domestic law in our countries, and international law is quite a recent concept. So, for example, sex between men is currently illegal in 72 countries around the world. Punishable by death in 8 countries. There are only 30 countries in the world that recognise same-sex marriage. So that means about 140 countries that don't recognise same-sex marriage. I'm proud to say in the Foreign Office, in many countries we actually marry same-sex couples in embassies in countries where they can't get married outside the wall. They can come into the embassy married inside the wall if they have a British partner, for example, in that marriage, because we see that's the right thing to do. But of course, that has changed. That wasn't the case 10, 20 years ago in the UK. Things have moved on. And in the first UN resolution on LGBT rights wasn't until 2008, which is only 12 years ago. Then I think there's a big question about what are rights. That's a live issue. For many years, communist governments advocated the importance of social and economic rights. So, for example, governments in Asia talk about social and economic rights being more important than, say, personal freedoms, the right to eat, to have a job, to live in safety. These are more important than personal freedoms. Some developing countries talk about the right to migration, for example, the right to development. How do you balance those issues against the right to free speech, the right to a fair trial? Obviously, from UK's perspective, I think from Finland's perspective, there are universal human rights in this area which are paramount and more important. But there's a long-running debate and a very current debate in all sorts of UN bodies. And then there's a big issue about retrospection, I think. And I was asked to say a bit about the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, clearly the Black Lives Matter movement is a very significant movement. I think it comes out of frustration of the black community in many countries about their status in society, discrimination, how they've been treated over many decades. And clearly there must be efforts to address those questions. But then you get into issues there about retrospective compensation, for example. Should you compensate individuals or countries for the horrors of slavery? Slavery, and a lot of that's focused on Britain, for example. We obviously were a country that had colonies that had slavery. Some of my grandmother's ancestors owned slaves. If you lived in the 18th century in Britain and you had any money, you would own slaves either directly or indirectly. It was very common. And there's a big campaign, for example, by countries in the Caribbean to seek compensation. Now, the UK abolished slavery in 1807. Sweden, aka Finland, didn't abolish it until much later, about 20 years later. And so Finland, for example, and ships from Finland and merchants from Finland were complicit in the slave trade. So should we be saying that Finland should be paying compensation to the victims, the descendants of victims of slavery, for example? Big question. I think most European governments would reject a direct connection between the horrors of slavery and compensation, but that's obviously a live issue. Then we get on to the issue of what is diplomacy, the other part of the bit that I do every single day. And diplomacy is the conduct or management of relations between states. And the states bit is the important bit, I think, because obviously we have human rights, we have international human rights law, we have norms of behaviour in human rights, but actually the way we work is governed by states, and states operate as independent, autonomous legal entities. Even Finland is part of the European Union, but most of competence in Finland is a Finnish national responsibility, including a lot of these rights areas. So how, in a sense, do you actually make international law and international norm work as a diplomat? I represent one country in another country, which has obviously legal sovereignty and independence from my country. There's also, obviously, I'm subject to the Vienna Convention which governs the way diplomats behave. So that means, on the one hand, I can't be arrested by the police, but also it limits what I can do in somebody else's country. I can't get on the tram and start attacking the government, for example. I'm not going to do that, but that wouldn't be regarded as a good thing, and I'd be asked to leave the country pretty quickly if I were to do that. And so there are limits to what you can do. And also, of course, as a diplomat, in my role, I have to balance all sorts of objectives. So clearly, for me personally and for my government, human rights is a very important issue, but also I have to try and advance the consular rights of British nationals in Finland. I have to promote trade, which benefits British nationals in the UK specifically. I have to think about defence, I think about security, lots of issues, and I have to balance all those issues together. Now in Finland, that's actually a relatively easy job, frankly, because Finland and the UK generally agree about most things. But some of my colleagues in other countries, it's a much more difficult job for how you balance those responsibilities. The world as it is. Finland, for example, has a very elaborate relationship with Russia next door because of your history and your place here. But of course, Finland doesn't agree with Russia on certain rights issues, for example. But that relationship has to continue, and I have to say more about that. So how do you deal with that? How do I deal with that? How does the UK deal with this? The world being made of states, trying to balance different responsibilities and priorities. So obviously, the first thing is obviously action on human rights is not just about the UK. So we will try and work with our partners, such as Finland, wherever we can on human rights dossiers. So we have a very good relationship on collaborating on human rights with Finland. And that can involve a number of things. So for example, trying to set up new customs of behaviour, trying to introduce new conventions, international conventions, trying to get people to sign up to conventions and ratify them so they come into force. More specifically, actually using existing law to raise issues in bodies. So for example, in the UN Security Council, in your General Assembly, and particularly in Human Rights Council. So there's a Human Rights Council in Geneva, where the UK is a very active player in the Human Rights Council in Geneva. It has annual sessions. I think you have, for example, there regular motions on, for example, on Syria, the war in Syria, on Myanmar, in the past on the Congo. You have all sorts of things there, and these are means by which the UK and its friends can express views and concerns about human rights in other parts of the world. Though that sounds a lot of words, but actually that's quite important what happens in the Human Rights Council, because what is written down in UN statements and declarations may one day end up in conventions and laws down the track. So it's like a quite important area for establishing precedents, and so it's quite, I wouldn't say there's sort of street warfare, because that's not how the thing works, but there's a lot of wordsmithing going on in Geneva to make sure that what we see as important human rights are protected and preserved. Through the Human Rights Council, there's something called the UPR process, Universal Periodic Review. So every country has a sort of peer review of its human rights observance, and that applies to Finland, it applies to the UK, it applies to China, for example, and recommendations are made on how you should improve your human rights performance, and that's something that obviously we go along with and comply with and work with as we can, because that is part of our obligation. The other things obviously that can be done, down time, we've seen the establishment of courts to actually adjudicate human rights. So there's now an International Criminal Court, for example. There's there's an International Court of Justice. There is the Human Rights Court in Strasbourg, and obviously it is possible for individuals, potentially supported by states, to take issues to those courts to be adjudicated and for judges to take a view about things. Then there's quite a controversial issue around humanitarian intervention. So if you have a situation where the human rights situation is so egregious in country X, notwithstanding the Westphalian principle of independence of states, does the world have the right to intervene in that state to, say, basically remove the government, change the government, put in place a government which is going to observe the rights of that state? That is a very controversial issue in international politics. There is a school of practice and law around seeking, for example, UN sanction, UN Security Council sanction to do that. There's also a school of thought saying you don't need necessarily to do that. A very early example in the 1970s where the Vietnamese government overthrew the Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia was overthrown by the Vietnamese government. That was partly for security reasons, but also ostensibly because Khmer Rouge was so terrible and ghastly and killed so many of its people that they had to be removed. At the time, that was condemned by the world and was completely as a sort of violation of this principle of Westphalian agreement and so on and so forth. Things have moved on. You've had obviously things like Kosovo and Sierra Leone and other things where things have moved on, but that is obviously quite a controversial question about humanitarian intervention. What authority you need to actually take that forward. Then, of course, as I said, the UK will always try and work in a way with its allies and try and work with international law and international instruments. But of course, you can also take sort of plurilateral action, so small groups, or unilateral action. So, for example, as I mentioned, Belarus as an example. The situation in Belarus is pretty serious. Now that is being addressed in Strasbourg, in the European Council. Council of Europe, and also by the OSCE as well, both addressing the human rights situation in Belarus, and that's something which we obviously were working with Finland on, for example, to take that forward. That is being dealt with in a regional bloc, not more widely. Then, of course, you get into sort of public diplomacy and action, so you can make statements, famously words. You often see a lot of the Foreign Secretary has made a statement about X, or Minister Harvester has made a statement about X. Words do matter. Preferably make statements in groups or with others to have more impact. But you can make public statements about human rights. You can have public messaging. One thing that we do as an embassy with other embassies actually in Helsinki is we participate in the annual Helsinki Pride events. This year largely online rather than in person. But we do that all over the world, because we think that this agenda is very important to us, and this is a physical demonstration of our commitment to these issues. And we do that in the United States, in Finland, but also in countries where there are more challenging, frankly, situations for gay and lesbian people. Often, actually, one of the ways that we would deal with this diplomat is to raise things in private. So often, if you want something to happen, seeing challenging somebody in public, particularly in a country which might have a more, shall we say, more confrontational culture is a bad idea. And generally you might want to start doing that in private, to say, no, this isn't such a good idea, and try to explain why it's a good idea to move things forward before you go public. That will be quite a standard diplomatic tactic. And then finally, something which I have been involved in myself a bit more is how you actually change societies, really. So obviously, my job is not to say to other societies how you should conduct yourself. However, we believe in the UK, for example, in the importance of education for girls. For example, that's a UK government priority, and we fund the education of girls in Afghanistan, in Africa, in all sorts of places, because we think that's important. And if you look at development theory and practice, that says that one way you change the rights of people in a society is to actually improve the educational level of girls and women, because women are the most important change agents in developing countries, not men. So if you can actually improve Their education, that's not saying telling them how to behave, but it's actually raises a prospect of more development and therefore perhaps a different view of some of these rights views. That can be more targeted, so obviously we work with civil society bodies. I mean, currently in Belarus, we are working, as we can do, with civil society bodies in Belarus to try and help promote and protect human rights. That's quite a difficult thing to do. I'm sure Finland is doing that as well. There's a big thing now actually around international business. International business actually has a huge role in human rights actually. If a big multinational which has an office in every country decides that it's going to have a LGBTI policy, that has a big impact on the way in which its operations work, and therefore can be very important. So, for example, there's something in some countries, there's something called the pink dot movement, basically where these are companies that actually advocate LGBT rights and work together to promote those, fund events and so on and so forth for their staff and to make a point, which is a good thing. So those are other ways in which you can move things forward. Similarly, court systems. If you have law, you are adjudicated. In many countries, we will work on trying to develop the court system often in very specific ways to try and strengthen institutions to actually enforce the rights that need to be observed. So that's a quick canter through from me of how I see things. I hope that was interesting. I'm very happy to take any questions from the room and move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I just have an observation,
Yes.
I guess, at this point. I don't know if you were aware that when Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin
Yes.
were in Finland, Helsingin Sanomat, the biggest newspaper in Finland, were running, it was sort of an advertising
Yes, it's very good.
campaign.
It was excellent as well, yes.
That's right,
I saw that,
because
yes.
all the big billboards were put on the journey,
Yes.
and it said freedom, welcome to the country where we have freedom of speech or something.
Yes, yes.
So things like that are popping up also in the sort of media and, as you said,
No.
companies. Yeah.
Yes, no. So there are, as you say, it's a coalition effort. I think, actually.
Yeah. Good.
Lots of questions.
I'll maybe ask one question
Yes.
off camera.
Yes.
You started by taking us through the legal basis,
Yes.
the national legal basis
Yeah.
for human rights, and talked about the issues that potentially exist within enforcing that. As a diplomat, you are, I assume, basically serving also political masters who have different political interpretations of human rights and so on. So could you talk a little bit about the balance that you presumably have to strike between an interpretation of international law and the political drive basically coming from masters that will change, on a periodic basis?
As a diplomat, as a UK civil servant, I'm bound by the Civil Service Code, and that has some very clear guidance in there about my responsibilities to follow the law, basically. That's international law and UK domestic law. But also at the same time, and the code also says that I need to serve the government of the day to my best of ability within the law. So obviously that is an interesting conundrum there. But ultimately, civil servants are bound by the law, and there have been individual incidents under all sorts of governments in which civil servants have said we don't think we can do this, or have said or advised ministers that it would be unwise for them to take certain actions.
Thank you.
And one question is that, of course, there are different systems. You had mentioned, for example, the old communist, even socialist or conservative societies that are present today. And in theory, all of these societies, they have an idea in theory that they want to promote human rights and they want better societies and the betterment of everyone in theory. And generally in the West, it's seen as being very liberal. So what is the approach when, in theory, different systems are arguing for different methods to get the betterment of people, but it ends up being in conflict with the particular ideology that is being used to go forward with this.
Well, as I said, I mean, ultimately we believe that certain rights are universal. I mean, as you said, there are societies that, for example, believe in the collective. You know, the group is more important than the individual, or as I said, social rights are more important than individual rights. But obviously, you know, we don't ultimately subscribe to that view. We think that rights are universal, and each individual has a right, which are inalienable to themselves. But obviously, swimming through that is a difficult task. But I think things do move. I mean, things move both ways. So, for example, you know, we're now living in a Europe where 30 years ago it is now, since the end of the Cold War, more or less. You know, a lot of European countries were communist regimes where human rights were not very well observed. Now that has changed. There are countries in Europe where, frankly, human rights are under pressure, frankly, including within the European Union, very clearly. But these things tend to ebb and flow. But I would like to believe that the flow of rights isn't. I wouldn't say it is complacent to say it's all in the right direction. But if you look, certainly since the Second World War, we have seen more countries signing up to these conventions. You've seen the spread of development. You've seen rights, I think, improving in many countries. Slowly in some places, but things are moving, I would say, generally in the right direction. But there clearly are countries where that's not the case, unfortunately. And obviously, the UK government will do its best to address those in tandem and concert with other governments, and also individuals within those countries who want their societies to change and to improve.
It's interesting what you said about the sort of direction, if you like. Just recently we had, was it Poland and Hungary, who were literally being forced by the EU funding.
Yes.
So money talks as well in implementing human rights, if you like.
Yes.
And also, if we look at the recent election in the US, I mean, what are the sort of values there? Is it really democracy and equality, or is it just, I don't know, country and family and impacting the discussion culture?
Well, well, those are all quite difficult subjects to address.
I know.
But I think, the United States. There's been a lot of commentary in Finland on the US elections lately, but the United States is a country built on law. It is a democracy. It has strong institutions, and we are seeing that law, that constitution in action now, as we've seen. One party, one leader is being voted out, and one leader is being voted in, and on whatever it is, inauguration day, there'll be a new president of the United States, and the US will go in a slightly different direction. But the base of it will remain the constitution. The legal base will remain the same. Of course, within the European Union, we're not EU members anymore. That's not really our fight anymore. But clearly, we have expressed concerns about clearly some things going on in Poland and Hungary are things we would not agree with and are concerned.
It feels it's almost like a dance, one step forward, 2 steps back, or sideways at times.
Yes. But it is. Things, as I said, things do evolve. Talking about the issue of slavery, for example. Slaves going back to ancient times were basically property. You had a right to own a horse or to own a house as to own another person. That was legally, that was what the law said, basically. And then that clearly you get the Enlightenment, and that starts to become unacceptable, and then you move to the point where it's banned, and then you have a question about how you enforce that later on, and that I suppose that question about how you deal with the abolition of slavery, in a sense, is still going on through the Black Lives Matter, because obviously the Black Lives Matter, the way in which certain communities statistically are disadvantaged compared to other communities is very obvious, and there has to be a reason behind that. Some of that's to do with history and social developments and so on and so forth, so there's a question there to be addressed. So these things change. But I'm sure there'll be new new rights issues will come up, but that's the other thing. I don't know what there'll be, but there'll be other human rights issues. And you've seen, obviously, LGBTI rights have changed enormously in the last post-war period in our society, so other things will move forward. I mean, there's a very legitimate issue, again, actually, in Finland, which is the issue of religious rights. In Finland recently, you'll probably know, there was a question about last year, a question about the prevention of halal slaughter in Finland, for example, and recently there's been a big issue around male circumcision, which I can talk about that publicly, you see now in public form, about male circumcision, which was effectively being debated to be banned in Finland, and that debate, both debates actually have happened across the Nordic countries actually recently, Iceland, Sweden, recently. Now, from the UK perspective, we fundamentally believe that in this instance that freedom of religion is very important, and if communities want to slaughter animals in a certain way or want to circumcision in a certain way, that is their right, and they should be able to do that. And there are different views about that, but that will be our UK view right across the parties, but that will be our position. But that's a controversial issue in Finland, and for example on halal slaughter, clearly there is a tension there between animal rights. People have rights. Animals have. Do animals have rights? Well, the law says you need to treat animals in a certain way. You can't beat your horse, for example. You're not supposed to do that. So with halal slaughter, for example, how do you balance with the rights of animals with the rights of people to follow certain beliefs, or the rights of people to eat meat? We think those things can be compatible. In a way forward. But I also think actually in terms of rights, I think again this is where I think there's a bit of difference between the UK, the British tradition, or more specifically the English tradition, and also the continental tradition, because in the UK tradition we have obviously our common law basis, which means that essentially you can effectively fudge a lot of issues. So in this huge morass of rights and how you balance them, you can actually have basically a sort of, not a fudge, but often on many of these issues it's better not to say this is allowed and this is permitted. Often that is a bad thing to do. It's better to be a bit vaguer about it with an overall framework than you allow a bit of flexibility and pragmatism. I think in many countries, including in Finland, often there's a desire to say this is what you can do, this is what you can't do. And from my personal perspective, often maybe not the right way to do it with some of these controversial issues, where allowing some flexibility often is a better way to deal with them, and allow people to behave in the way that they want to behave.
The phraseology from Oliver Twist comes to mind.
Yes.
That if that is the law, my sir, then the law is us.
Yes.
Just related to what you were just saying,
Yeah.
I know that Britain is one of the 2 countries in the world, I believe, that doesn't have a formal written constitution. So from what you're saying, do you think we're better off not to have one? Because sometimes it seems like a human, right to show you.
Okay. So the position of the British government, current British government, is not to have a written constitution. So that would be the British government which I represent. I mean, the reality is, as everything in the UK, it's a bit more complicated because we do have bits of a written constitution. So we have Human Rights Act, we have legislation on discrimination, for example. We have there's a legislation on ratification of treaties, for example. So there are lots of bits of the constitution are there. They're not just all brought into a single document.
Do you think it's a strength, though?
Well, you could take it both ways, can't you? You could say it's a strength or not a strength. I mean, again, I'm straying into politics here, but one of the we just talked about the United States, for example. So you could argue one of the great strengths of the United States is that it has a written constitution. Perhaps one of the great weaknesses of the United States is it has a written constitution, because you have a situation where the US Constitution is designed to prevent somebody having supreme power, basically designed to stop having a King George again. You have massive separation of powers between the states and the federal government, between the houses and so on and so forth, and that actually guarantees rights, but it means moving things forward often is a bit difficult because getting everything aligned is quite hard in the United States. So the same in France. If you don't have a constitution, you can make dramatic changes fairly more rapidly. Obviously, you could say that could be in the right direction or in the wrong direction, but that's a matter of politics, and each country needs to find a way of doing it. But I think the fact in the United Kingdom is actually, we have actually seen, if we don't have a constitution, actually we've seen the law extend hugely, and actually the role of judges have extended hugely, particularly in the last couple of decades. So, you know, if you go back in time, you know, a prime minister could declare war. Basically, he'd get out of bed and declare war. You know, effectively, I mean, this is what Anthony Eden did. He basically got out of bed and decided to invade, you know, attack Egypt. Now that couldn't happen. That wouldn't happen today. So actually, the you know, the power of the government has actually been, even like my current prime minister has a big majority in the House of Commons, that has been actually reduced over time by the way in which the law has evolved. I mean, the courts can actually strike down legislation, for example, in the UK. That's quite a recent innovation. So the law is super. So things are moving all the time. So we'll have to see what comes in the future.
Maybe one last question around rights in general. We've spent a lot of time talking about human rights.
Yes.
You started talking about animal rights.
Yes, yes.
Who is it that actually decides what is a right? How do we, as either a nation states or a collection of nation states, decide that you know, plants do or do not have rights, or
Yes.
a right to clean air, which crosses borders without?
Well, exactly. Yes. Well, that's a good point. So I mean, you can see. So coming back to my pointing to the last question. So the law is a constantly expanding thing, I think, in reality. And you know, there may be some people in the United Kingdom who don't want the law to go on expanding. They want to be able to do what I want to do. But inevitably, the law just continues expanding because, and certainly in the UK system, and the wrong reason for that is because we have the common law, and if you have a dispute, you go to a court, and then the judge ultimately might decide to do X. That establishes a precedent, and things spread. So I think the same thing is true of rights, in a sense. The rights come out of, partly they come out of law having to deal with the world as it changes. So then you have to, the judge will make a ruling, and that establishes, in a sense, a right or not right. I think it also comes actually from a sort of societal consensus about what is or what is not right. You know, I think that is also important factor. So, for example, you know, same-sex marriage. If you'd asked somebody on a British bus in 1962, they would, you know, I think from 95% of people said this is terrible, we can't have this. You know, things have moved on. 30 plus years later, that's moved because society has moved. So I think it's sort of bottom up and top down. But you can also have, I mean, again, in our system, you could have sort of dramatic changes. So, for example, famously in the 1960s, we had Jenkins, who was you probably remember, was quite a famous Home Secretary, a Labour Home Secretary that happened. You know, he actually moved rights quite rapidly because, for example, he basically supported legislation which removed the ban on homosexual acts, for example, was because he supported that. He basically got rid of the death penalty. There's a great story about him that actually in his office, when he moved into his office in the 1960s, behind his desk there was a big, basically like a chalk drawing board with the names of people who were going to be executed. So they sort of moved down the board, and then eventually they'd be executed, you know, for murder or some serious crime. And he got rid of that. One of his first acts was to get rid of that and replace it with a drinks fridge, which he thought was much more important than having this terrible board they didn't like. So you kind of have individuals that change, accelerate this process. You know, like the famous example of, you know, Wallenberg in Hungary or something. Individuals who bravely move the process, but I think a lot of it's sort of bottom up. That's my personal view.
I want to ask a question.
Of course.
How do you see the role of social media these days in contributing to human rights and diplomacy? And how do you see the engagement of the youth?
Oh wow, that's a very difficult question, isn't it? Yes. So I don't know. Well, social media is controversial because on one hand it's a very good thing. On one thing, it has lots of risks, doesn't it, as well? Really, I mean, social media is again, you can't really. You know, social media will go on evolving. Over time. I mean, I suppose coming back to what, you know, on rights, So, for example, thinking about rights, why did the Black Lives Matter movement spark off? Obviously, the issue's been there for years, and we've seen it come and go in the United States, for example, and other countries. Because somebody took a video of George Floyd being abused and then basically being killed, effectively, by the police. Now, that wouldn't have happened, or would have been unlikely to have happened a couple of decades ago because there wasn't a mobile phone to take the footage. So that's interesting. So you get a lot of this, I think, in Belarus, and some very brave people are using their mobile phones to photograph images of the police beating protesters. So things have moved in a way that wouldn't be. So I suppose it provides a greater sort of visibility of rights. On the other hand, the whole nature of social media is it's quite sort of episodic. So actually what it gives you is this little snapshot of something, which can be a very personal snapshot or a very tangential snapshot. You don't get a whole view, clearly, from social media necessarily. So I think that is some of the risks around social media. Ultimately, things have to be in mind. I would say this is an official need to be dealt with the proper way. You have a problem, you complain about it, you go to the police, you deal with it through the courts rather than doing it on social media. But it can be a good amplifier. And then when you talk about youth, young people and what rights do you think?
Mm-hmm. Their engagement.
Well, I suppose when I was young, I went on protests and demonstrations. And this is what I wanted to do, isn't it? Really, I mean, you want people to be engaged in issues. I think obviously the classic example is the whole climate issue, and you've got Greta Thunberg and people very active on the climate issue, and a lot of that. I mean, you could. There's something called Extinction Rebellion, for example. You take one of the more extreme actions, and you could probably say is illegal, unnecessarily illegal, and not very helpful. But generally speaking, I feel energised on the climate issue because my children are more aware of it than I am, to be honest, and that provides me with energy that makes change. So I think it's good for young people to be engaged in rights issues, and they're driving a lot of the change. I think how these things evolve over time. Okay. Thank you very much. Stop.
I think that we've reached the end.
Yes,
I've
yes.
had trillions of questions.
Oh, please, well, I'm going to ask them afterwards. Don't worry. Hopefully that was interesting.
I'm now worried.
No, don't be worried.
Examples and observations.
Yes.
I think this is a very interesting
Yes,
topic, so
yes.
thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
coming and talking to us
Thank you.
and giving your views. So very, very important.
Yes.
Shall we?
Give you a little thank
Oh my
you
God, thank you very much.
for
God, thank you.
Your
That's
time and
very kind.
expertise.
Well, thank you. Oh, right, excellent. So I'm not sure about my expertise. Yes, anyway, as you say, it's thank you. Oh, I'm applauding. Thank you.